I know most of you in the room here, but just for the record, my name is Matt Zwolinski. I'm a professor of philosophy here at the University of San Diego, also director of USD's Center for Ethics, Economics, and Public Policy. And it is my pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to our event, which is a conversation with Keith Whittington, who is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at the Department of Politics in Princeton University. He is the author of a number of books, including Repugnant Laws, Judicial Review of Acts of Congress from the Founding to the Present, which is the winner of the Thomas M. Cooley Book Prize, and most relevant to our discussion today, Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech, which also won a prize, the Prose Award for Best Book in Education, and the Heterodox Academy Award for Exceptional Scholarship. He is chair of the Academic Committee of the Academic Freedom Alliance, an organization which we'll hear much more about this afternoon. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, has served on the Presidential Commission of the Supreme Court of the United States. And if at the end of our discussion today you found that you just haven't got enough of him, you can follow him on Twitter, K.E. Whittington at Twitter. You can follow him in the Volokh Conspiracy, where he blogs, and on the Academic Freedom Podcast, which he is the host of. So I'm going to start off asking Keith a few questions. We'll get a conversation going, and once that's reached a certain point, we'll welcome questions from you guys as well, so feel free to just raise your hand. It's a small group, so we can be fairly informal about this. If you want to chime in at any point, just raise your hand and I'll take note of you. So Keith, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about the Academic Freedom Alliance. What is that, and how did you get involved with it?
So it's designed to be a broadly diverse, cross-ideological group of faculty concerned specifically with trying to advance principles of academic freedom and professorial free speech, defend people who find themselves in the midst of free speech controversies on their own campuses. We partially speak out in support of individuals who find themselves in that situation, try to explain to campus leadership about what the free speech rights that those individuals have under those circumstances, and encourage university officials to do the right thing in the midst of those controversies. And if necessary, we try to provide legal support and representation to those individuals, and if necessary, pursue litigation to vindicate their rights in those situations. It really began a little over a year ago now, I guess. We were having a series of conversations with some of my colleagues at Princeton about things we could do to do more to help out on these issues. It's part of what led me to write the Speak Freely book in the first place, was those kinds of conversations about what could we be doing to help advance these principles to some degree. We were bouncing around various ideas, including sort of the idea of a kind of legal defense fund for faculty who find themselves under pressure under these circumstances. There was partially a view that professors who find themselves in the midst of these controversies are often very isolated generally on their own campuses, but also isolated professionally more broadly. So it was important for people to speak up in their behalf and their defense, help let people know that they are not completely on their own under these circumstances, in order to sort of bolster their spirit as well as provide some support. We're still trying to hash through sort of what that kind of organization ought to look like, or what kinds of activities that ought to look like in general. We had a Princeton alum who actually came to some of the people who were involved in that conversation and suggested he'd be willing to put up some funds to help support an organization like that if we thought there were useful things to do. And that really sort of focused our mind some on thinking about a legal defense fund and really providing legal representation in particular to individuals who might need it under those circumstances. Because it's one thing to write letters, it's another thing to actually provide a lawyer. The providing a lawyer requires some financial resources to be able to do it. And so for now, we have the kind of financial resources to do some of that, and I think it's critically important. We've been publicly operating for several months now, and I am the chair of the academic committee. The academic committee is the sort of core decision-making body for this organization. And I think one thing I certainly underestimated when we got rolling was how many cases there are out there. We certainly get a lot of requests for help. We're not able to help everybody, not by a long shot. But it really has highlighted, once you start getting in the weeds of these things, you sort of come to a greater appreciation, I think, about how much need there is for an entity like this and the range of problems that people are confronting out there. I think part of that, I've also come to appreciate how many of these kinds of disputes fly completely below the public radar. And so writing about these issues, thinking about these issues, I certainly focus on the kinds of cases that come to public light that were to attract media attention and the like. One thing I did not appreciate was just how many of these kinds of disputes never get any kind of media attention. Faculty often don't want them to get media attention. They would prefer that they be handled quietly if they can be. And so a lot of our work is actually being done quietly with university administrators trying to resolve these disputes without public attention if we can. And I also just didn't appreciate just how badly behaved universities really were. And so when you start talking to people who find themselves enmeshed in these disputes, I think you come to a whole new appreciation of just how Byzantine the procedures tend to be, how willing universities are to violate their own policies and procedures on these things. And so it certainly, to my mind, is helped highlight how important it is actually to have legal representation in these circumstances. That you really need somebody that can help you navigate the rules and call universities out when they are not adhering to their own rules on these things. And unfortunately, I think there are a lot of situations where universities do need to be called out on these things.
Well, great. There's a lot I'd like to dive in more deeply there. So first of all, maybe help situate the Academic Freedom Alliance a bit more in the landscape of other organizations that are out there, because there's some other organizations that are doing similar things. The ACLU is concerned with free speech. You have the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which also does legal work related to free speech issues on campus. You have the American Association of University Professors, I suppose, which maybe does some of this stuff. So how does Academic Freedom Alliance kind of situate itself in that broader organization?
One of the early questions when we were talking about this is there actually a need for another organization like this, or is there enough stuff being done already such that there's no value added in having a new organization? And I think we sort of became convinced that there was value in having a new organization. I think now that we've launched and have been doing this for a while, I'm much more confident even that there's value in doing that. I see us as working in alliance with a lot of these other organizations. There are some sister organizations more senior than us who are involved in this space, and they do good work. I think partly they are also overwhelmed, and so partially I think there just is value in having another organization that help take up some of the slack. So for example, I'm on the board of directors for the Foundation for Individual Rights of Education, FIRE. They do terrific work. They have more work than they can handle. And so I think there's just space for additional organizations to help out those kind of organizations in some of these cases. I think there's also utility in partially supplementing their voices. So I thought early on, for example, that it was valuable for university leaders to hear from faculty and not just hear from an organization like FIRE, for example. That maybe we would carry some additional moral weight in academia itself from being able to speak out for this. Part of who we wanted to bring into the organization initially were faculty who are committed to these principles, but also some people who are pretty preeminent and prestigious, and as a consequence, hopefully would carry some weight in these conversations. University presidents might sit up and take notice if you had an organization of what we initially were hoping just a few dozen. We now have almost 400 members. Our hope was the university presidents would sort of sit up and take notice if you had some distinguished people writing to them saying, hey, look, you're not doing this right. There's some principles here you need to be thinking more carefully about. I think that's something that faculty just can't outsource. We have to be willing to stand up for some of these things ourselves and supplement some of these other voices. And I think we also have a somewhat different perspective on some of these issues than some of these other organizations. So FIRE, for example, is a lawyer-driven organization. It does terrific work. They have great lawyers there, but they approach it like lawyers. And in part that means, for example, that they particularly tend to focus on state university context where constitutional rights are at stake, and they can leverage that, which makes a lot of sense. There's certainly lots of conflicts and problems there. But of course, a lot of the higher ed landscape is private universities. Those are often messier, but they involve more contractual rights. They involve questions about sort of what the principles and missions of those universities are. I think sometimes university professors are better situated to sort of appreciate some of the nuances of those issues and to be able to articulate what principles are at stake there. FIRE also has a broader mission than we do. They're trying to deal with student rights as well as faculty rights. They do due process considerations, which we mostly try to stay out of, and are trying to focus on faculty speech in particular. ACLU obviously has a much broader mission. And so, this is only a sliver of the things they can worry about. It's also true ACLU, I think, increasingly has a somewhat complicated understanding of their relationship to civil liberties and their mission relating to free speech. And so, from my perspective, they're not always good about these issues. And so having something that has a little more laser-like focus on free speech seems valuable. And the foundation stone for a lot of the work we do is the work that the American Association of University Professors did across the early 20th century in convincing universities to build into their contracts protections for academic freedom, to articulate these kinds of principles of academic freedom that we're not piggybacking on and trying to implement and preserve and maintain. The AAUP obviously continues to do that as well, but they also have a more complicated mission. They do a lot of labor rights issues. They serve as labor unions on a lot of campuses. So they're sort of pulled in different directions about what it is they're trying to do. And again, we thought then a sort of single issue-oriented organization would be helpful to really one, sort of minimize the conflicts and tensions between some of those different commitments, but also to make sure that we're just focused on this, and this is what we're going to dedicate ourselves to, and not be spending lots of time on, unfortunately, all the other things that also need to be done on university campuses. And so I thought there was space there for another organization like this, and I still think that's true.
Yeah. That's great. So I want to talk more about the values of free speech and academic freedom, but before we get into those more conceptual questions, maybe just to give people a taste of the kinds of things that you've been doing at AFA, can you talk about a case or two, either that's maybe representative of the normal sort of thing that you do, or that stands out to you as exceptional or illustrative in some particular way?
Yeah, so we've already seen sort of a pretty wide range of conflicts that we've gotten involved in, even just in the few months that we've been operating publicly in our current form. Some of them involve what often gets a lot of attention now, and I think is a much larger set of these kind of free speech controversies than used to be the case, which is professors saying controversial things in public. So social media posts are a source of difficulty for faculty across the country these days. It gives faculties, it gives the members of the public an unfiltered view of faculty opinions about all kinds of controversial things, sometimes expressed in very few characters. And that's not the optimal way of expressing nuance oftentimes, and social media sometimes encourages people to be particularly provocative and inflammatory in various ways. And there's often backlash to that. And so I think over the last several years, we've seen sort of a growing set of controversies surrounding that kind of speech by faculty that I think used to mostly not attract the same kind of attention. And it's, if what we saw were sort of people writing letters to the editor or saying something in a local town meeting, that just doesn't attract the same kind of attention that sometimes social media postings will. So we've been involved in some of those kinds of cases already, certainly in which people are getting in trouble for blog posts or social media posts that they've made, and somebody objects whether people are objecting from the campus community, or people are objecting from outside the campus, and trying to bring attention to this. And one thing that's sort of true in just the cases we've seen, but also I think is true across the board on these things, is this is not just a left-wing problem or a right-wing problem at this point. Faculty from across the ideological spectrum, I think, are sort of nervous about their own speech rights. We see threats to faculty speech from across the ideological spectrum. It is often the case that when controversies arise on campus itself, it tends to be sort of from a left-wing perspective. Student activists and the like, who tend to be on the left, are more likely so far to be the ones leading the charge. When we see complaints from people off campus, it's often from the political right putting pressure on faculty. So we found ourselves involved in some of those cases of both sorts, including one of the very first cases we got involved in of this type was a case involving a law professor here at University of San Diego, Tom Smith, who had published a blog post commenting on the pandemic, in which he was critical of the Chinese government as part of that. That was read by some students, at least, as expressing an anti-Asian bias more generally, which led to an investigation by the university. We thought that his blog post was clearly covered by these kind of free speech and academic freedom principles. The university had no role in sanctioning him for that speech, and we tried to provide assistance to him through that process, both in terms of public commentary and in terms of providing legal representation to help him out in that situation. And we've had other cases that look like that, but we've also had cases that involve classroom conduct in which students object to things people have said in the classroom. As you would expect, that's, I think, the place where students are on the front lines on that front. They're the ones who see what happens in a classroom. And so when there are objections about instructor behavior in classrooms, it tends to come from students first. Sometimes gets picked up by other constituencies, but that's where it starts. And so we've seen some of those cases already. We just intervened in a case the other day in which a university dean is trying to terminate a faculty member. There are other kinds of issues that the university is claiming is involved here, but the starting point for the dispute and part of the grounds for termination was that the professor disagreed with the dean about curriculum changes to the math program at a community college, and the dean was unhappy with the professor's criticism of the policy the dean wanted to embark on, and from the professor's perspective, lowering the standards of the academic standards at the community college. So we tried to weigh in on that and saying, look, this is exactly the kind of thing faculty have a right to express their views about these things, and they shouldn't be subject to sanction from university officials as a consequence of speaking out on those kinds of cases. So you see the real gamut of, and some of them seem sort of obviously politically charged in various ways, but others are not particularly politically charged. There are these kind of classic instances of people having policy agreements, people with local disagreements, personality conflicts, et cetera, but involving speech rights claims that ought to be protected.
Good. So there's some very different context there
Yeah.
in these cases that you laid out, right? So there's professors writing things on their private blogs or private Twitter accounts. Yeah. There's professors disagreeing about curricular matters in the context of conversations with their academic supervisor, and then there's professors engaged in classroom speech inside the classroom,
right,
that students object to for various reasons. So maybe that's a good kind of lead in to talking about the idea of academic freedom, about the idea of free speech, how those are different, how those are related, and how you see your organization kind of navigating.
Yeah, so they are definitely different concepts, although there's a big swath of what we think of as traditional free speech that basically has been integrated into academic freedom protections. And so really functionally, academic freedom winds up incorporating a lot of free speech disputes and then some additional things as well. So the thing that looks most like free speech, so the starting point is thinking about a 1940 statement from the American Association of University Professors that laid down 3 core commitments for academic freedom in the United States that was extremely influential, winds up integrated into lots of university documents all across the country in terms of what kind of protections universities offer to faculty contractually that mirror the language the AUP first articulated in 1940 and has tried to elaborate since. And as I said, those has 3 components, and one of those components looks the most like the classic sort of free speech situation. So one of those components is what's sometimes characterized as extramural or intramural speech, or faculty expressing opinions about matters of public concern, acting as citizens, whether as citizens of their university or citizens of the country more generally. So that may mean faculty speaking up at a faculty meeting about what the math curriculum ought to look like, or what masking policy ought to look like on a university campus, for example. Or it might mean university faculty posting on social media or on blog posts about political issues more generally. So things that are not really connected to their scholarship or teaching as such, but really expressions of opinion about other related matters. And basically, they're just sort of all the standard issues associated with free speech protections are involved there. But the traditional reason to protect it was precisely because you don't want a backdoor mechanism by which universities can fire faculty for saying something controversial because they happen to have said it in a letter to the editor of a paper instead of they said it in a classroom or in their research, for example. And there's all kinds of circumstances where the content of the controversial thing that they're now in trouble for, they have expressed on social media, for example, but it also permeates their scholarship. And so you can't easily disentangle these 2 things. And I think as a consequence, you want a pretty firm rule. The universities can't punish people for that kind of political speech if you're going to have a intellectually vibrant university campus more generally. The 2 other components, though, they're more strictly speaking distinct from that and really at the core of academic freedom per se. One involves freedom to engage in teaching without fear of sanction from university, and freedom to engage in research and scholarship without fear of sanction from teaching. And neither of those 2 things quite mirror traditional free speech concerns, in part because they both come with a set of professional boundaries and limits associated with them. And so how we think about the freedom for teaching, for example, is not just that the faculty member can come in and say whatever they want in the classroom and are free to spend their time voicing whatever opinions they want. The expectation is that a faculty member in a classroom is engaging in speech that's relevant to the subject matter they're teaching, for example. So you don't expect your engineering professor to spend the class talking about the presidential election and how he feels about politics more generally. The kind of freedom of speech that he is authorized to engage in is freedom of speech that's precisely relevant to the subject matter as such. Moreover, you expect that in that context as well, that the freedom of speech the professor exercises is a speech that is professionally competent. So you also don't expect your geology professor, for example, to be spending the class talking about how the Earth is only 6,000 years old and is flat. And so if as a university official you discover that you had a science professor who was conveying that to students in the classroom, you quite appropriately would want to step in and say, this is not professionally competent knowledge, even if it may be within the subject matter of the class itself, for example. So that's different, though, than what we think of as a general free speech environment, right? So if a professor wants to write a letter to the editor or post on a blog that says, look, I really think the Earth is flat, and let me tell you why. That's a more general free speech concern, and people have all kinds of crazy opinions that we think they ought to be able to express as American citizens, and more specifically, university employers shouldn't sanction them for in general. But we have different expectations about what people are doing in the classroom, for example, or likewise what they're doing in scholarship, and there are boundaries then as to what kind of protected speech ought to look like in those contexts. Which makes those kinds of disputes more nuanced, more particular. They are much more connected to sort of the professional ethos of faculty, which is one reason why I think sort of lawyer-driven organizations like FIRE are a little less good about how to navigate some of those, and why it's important for faculty to speak up about those things and really try to talk about them and engage in protecting them, because those are very central to not just what we do on a day-to-day basis, but they specifically implicate our own sort of professional ethos about how people ought to conduct themselves in those environments. And you don't want to outsource that to simply say, well, lawyers can figure that out. Lawyers are not well placed to figure that out, right? You do sort of want faculty to be trying to think those issues through and trying to talk about and explain them.
I would imagine those professional boundaries those sort of limits to academic freedom, say within the classroom, must be fairly tricky to navigate because, right? I mean, if you have a professor going on what seems to be a irrelevant tangent in the classroom, and you push them on that, they're going to respond by making some argument for why it is relevant to the broader context of the classroom discussion. And then once you're in that debate, that seems like a difficult debate to navigate without, or perhaps a debate where maybe we'd want to get substantial deference to the teacher's interpretation of relevance and standards. How do those work in practice?
I think that's right. I think they can be very difficult to navigate, and there's a lot of gray areas here. I mean, it's often not obvious what the right answer is in some of these circumstances. And I think often the right outcome in some of these controversies is we ought to be talking them through and thinking about them rather than thinking about how do we sanction somebody and discipline somebody for having crossed some line that we think they might have crossed in those circumstances. So there's all kinds of dimensions on which these things can become pretty complicated to try to figure out. So there is sort of a different set of expectations as we think about sort of what counts as professionally competent speech, for example, in the teaching environment, for example. When I give examples of this, I often reach to the natural sciences because they have the cleanest examples, right, in some ways, right? So the geology professor who says the earth is flat, it's relatively easy to say that's not professionally competent knowledge, and you should get that person out of the classroom if that's what they're spending their time doing. The philosophy professor who says crazy things is a much trickier topic, right? Because it's much less clear where the boundaries are on what counts as professionally competent behavior from the philosophy professor. And so social sciences and humanities, I think, as well as other sort of disciplines on campuses, can become more complicated in that regard. And sort of what falls out of bounds just from that sort of professional competence perspective. Likewise, sometimes the decisions about what is professionally relevant to a class can become pretty tricky as well. So this is not one of our cases, but a case of somebody who's spent a lot of time doing the AUP investigations on these issues said as an example of this, where he got a call once from a faculty member who's being sanctioned in the English department because he wanted to include, I believe it was Jack Kerouac in his syllabus and assigned to the students. And so they're sort of scratching their heads and saying, well, that seems professionally relevant and competent. Of course, an English professor is going to assign Jack Kerouac. He said, yeah, but he's supposed to be teaching 17th century British literature, right? And so it's like, okay, well, now wait a second. Now I get where the conflict is, right? And so sometimes the lines are a little more subtle than one might expect, right? It's not just the case of the science professor who's spending time talking about politics. It's sometimes more tricky, and sometimes, and that's sort of easy from the outsider's perspective. You can sort of see those differences. Sometimes, though, it's much murkier, where you just think about some disciplines where you're making those judgments, and from the outsider's perspective, very hard to sort of really assess, okay, is that actually relevant to this or not? It's hard to know. And moreover, there's a lot of stuff that's just true about the nature of teaching that can make things difficult, right? And it's one of the challenges, I think, as well about our current environment of social media and sort of our polarized environment more generally. So one phenomenon that we now encounter are students who record classes and then release snippets of what happened in a class on the internet, for example. And so I think from a lot of faculty's perspective, you say all kinds of things in part to try to keep students interested, keep them engaged. You make jokes and whatever, trying to build rapport with students. And sometimes those are misguided and mistaken. But sometimes in context, they seem perfectly reasonable. If taken out of context, they can seem much less reasonable, right? And so then you might say, okay, well, what if we're dealing with the physics professor who tells a Trump joke in the course of the class? That's probably a different phenomenon than a professor who goes on a 45-minute rant about Trump in his class, as opposed to he tells a joke about Trump in his class in the context of trying to explain some point or in order to keep the students engaged or whatever. But you distribute that 30 seconds on social media and suddenly that becomes, okay, well, that's what the class is all about, right? And so that can be hard to both know what's happening in the classroom, but also try to explain those kinds of differences. And so I think you can have some real challenges and difficulties in that regard. So, one of the kinds of controversies that's arisen relative to classroom behavior in recent years, for example, is use of the N-word in class. And some of those cases that have arisen, I think, are actually quite difficult in the sense that they're close aligned and pretty much in the gray, and very much expose lots of gray areas and difficulties of judgment. And some, I think, are actually more straightforward and much easier to defend from my perspective. So we've seen examples, for example, where students object to faculty members reading the text that they've assigned the students to read aloud, right? And so that strikes me as very troubling when it's not possible to say aloud what it is you're assigning students to read. Because of the language in the text might be offensive, whether that's a matter of literature, you're reading Mark Twain, for example, and can you read it, or you're reading various other kinds of authors that might come up in that context, or whether you're talking about a legal context where the facts of the case might involve the N-word, for example, and the question is, can you actually say that aloud in the classroom? I think that's pretty much ought to be protected in lots of contexts. There are conversations we should have about when and how you should do it, but I think in terms of academic freedom, that's a relatively easy one. But for example, there was a faculty member who got in trouble a few years ago because he made a routine practice of singing along to a song that the students brought to him at the beginning of each class as a way of sort of keeping engaged with the students and being friendly and all this stuff. And at some point, as is the nature of our world today, students brought in a rap song that included the N-word as part of the song. He sings along with the song. A student records him singing along with the song. They then post it and post him as a consequence singing the N-word as part of the song in his class, right? Not central to the core educational thing that you're doing in the class, but you can sort of see, if you back up from it, you can sort of see the logic of how it is a professor finds themselves in that situation, right? Where it seemed like a good idea at the time to say, okay, well, look, as part of the icebreaking, keeping students engaged and building rapport and all that kind of stuff, we're going to sing the songs and stuff, and we're going to let students pick the song and all that stuff. And then in our current environment, and given the nature of music and our current sensitivities about these things, you find yourself in this situation. Trickier to defend, I think, and justify that that's fully protected by academic freedom. I think it's one of those things that's sort of in the gray area, but it's also one of those things where I think in a rational world we ought to be having a conversation about it rather than saying, okay, how can we fire this professor for doing it? And he was brought up on charges, and the university tried to dismiss him. And I actually don't remember whether he in fact was dismissed. I think he might have actually been terminated as a consequence of that episode, right? And it's just so there's certainly, and so one thing about the sort of academic freedom context is, in the university context, is that there are two questions here that are often hard to disentangle, one of which is, what is it within your rights to do such that you shouldn't be sanctioned for having done it? And then also questions about what's a good idea to be doing, and what was a wise and smart thing to do, and what's good judgment in these contexts. And those are separate questions. And it's very hard to keep those things separated. And I think but I think if we're going to actually deal with this seriously, we have to be thinking about both those things. There are times in which we might say, look, this is within his rights, you shouldn't punish him for doing it, but also it was exercise of bad judgment, and we should have a conversation about whether or not we ought to be doing those things in the future, for example.
The same distinction applies on the part of universities, right? I mean, what is within the rights of universities to do in response to certain behavior by faculty members or students, and what ought they to do, all things considered? Right. I mean, maybe you have the right to fire the guy, but maybe having a conversation.
Well, I think that's right too, right? I mean, so fortunately, I think at the moment we are in a situation in which, as I said, in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, a lot of universities embraced AUP language on academic freedom, brought it into their policies and faculty handbooks, and entered into a bunch of contractual relationships with faculty that protect freedom. But not all universities did. Some of them have language that actually is pretty sloppy in this regard and not as protective as it did. We've certainly seen lots of instances where universities when they find themselves in these controversies, they're trying to figure out how do we read that language as narrowly as possible so we can fire this person and minimize the scope of academic freedom in those contexts, or how can we read our handbook in a way that looked like we made a contractual commitment to you, but we really didn't. And so we, again, will sort of minimize what our legal obligations are to the faculty in these circumstances. And partially, we ought to be thinking seriously about, okay, what are the actual contractual commitments that have been made here? What are the rules actually say? But in part, we also ought to be thinking about, okay, look, even if the university does have the power to terminate somebody in these circumstances, what ought they to be doing in a manner that actually advances the larger mission of the university and maintains a larger atmosphere where we can have free exchange of ideas more broadly. And unfortunately, universities often are not thinking about that, where they embark on these things. And so, I do think we need to be both speaking out on both kind of situations. Some of those situations are situations where lawyers are helpful and you need them, and where threats of litigation are sometimes necessary. But some of these are situations where we ought to be talking through with colleagues as to what we ought to be doing in universities, and the lawyers are potentially less useful as part of that process.
So and I want to leave plenty of time for questions from you guys if you have them. So I'll ask one more question, then I'll turn to you. So be thinking of your questions. But one move that certain self-styled friends of free speech have increasingly turned to is legislation, either on the state or sometimes even on the federal level. Federal Campus Free Speech Restoration Act is one instance. Right. Of sort of looking at what's going on at universities, thinking that free speech is under threat, and thinking that we've got to pass some kind of new law to protect free speech. Is that a helpful development, misguided, a little bit of both, depending on the details?
I think a little bit of both. The details often matter a lot. In general, I tend to think, well, look, I think fundamentally, if universities do not clean their own house on this and do a good job, political interventions are going to happen. And so to some degree, this is just predictable. And then the challenge is going to be, how do you manage the political intervention rather than because the best way of preventing it from happening is to avoid engaging in bad behavior in the first place, at least in part. It's helpful, at least in trying to minimize some of these interventions. Generally speaking, I'd rather not have legislators be trying to do this. In part, I don't think they're well situated to evaluate these things and make good policies on this front. There are nuances here that legislators are not going to be very good at dealing with, and so the resulting policies are going to be worse than what the optimal policies would be. They may or may not be worse than what the policies actually are on specific university campuses. So that's a bit of a challenge. I also tend to think that one size fits all is not the right approach on these fronts, although a lot of these state legislative interventions have been aimed specifically at public universities. Legislatures have mostly been persuaded to leave private universities alone in this regard, which I think is the right approach. And in the context of thinking about public universities, a one size fits all makes more sense. It's in a category in which basically the same rules ought to apply more or less across the board. I do think for private universities, there's a lot more flexibility there about what kind of rules they actually want to adopt and should adopt. And there's some value in having some flexibility about that. And so it'd be unfortunate if legislators intervened in ways that restricted that. The other problem is, of course, that political interventions are not always on behalf of free speech. So you want to take advantage of the fact that sometimes public attention to these controversies, political interventions in these controversies, will enhance academic freedom and free speech. But it's frankly the case that politicians are sometimes hypocritical about these things, and sometimes are not very committed to free speech at all, and they have substantive things they want to accomplish, and they are perfectly happy to sweep free speech aside in order to advance the substantive interest. And we've seen lots of examples of that over time.
And the critical race theory.
And the critical race theory legislation, I think, is an example of that. So there was a few years ago a sort of a wave of campus free speech legislation. I think a lot of that wound up actually not being too bad in how it was designed. There were some pretty bad versions of it, but by the time they were adopted, a lot of them actually were pretty reasonable. The anti-critical race theory legislation I think has started off pretty messy, and the states have adopted it have been pretty messy, and I think in ways that are quite troubling from an academic freedom perspective at universities. And they're not very good even at the K through 12 level in terms of thinking about education. And so I think even if you might be sympathetic with part of what's motivating legislators in some of these situations, the ways in which they're going about doing it are not very attractive, and certainly are not very helpful from sort of an academic freedom, free speech perspective. And so, if I think on the whole, you don't necessarily want to encourage lots of political interventions in these spheres. Sometimes that will work out in your favor from a free speech perspective, but a lot of times it will not.
Questions from the group here, Larry?
Yeah, here's a question that I think was prompted by something that when I came in. I'm sorry, I had other things I had to get done. But so there's a wonderful article by Judy Thompson many years ago about disciplinary standards. So it's a favorite point of people like Stanley Fish and Robert Coast, that there's free speech, and then there are disciplinary standards, right? And those there may be overlap, but they're separate concerns. So, your free speech, and you can be in the geology department and proclaim that the earth is flat. You've got a free speech right to do that, but you might be denied tenure, right? In the geology department. And the question is sort of how conservative should disciplinary standards be? So one of the reasons for fairly conservative disciplinary standards is that first, if you're lax about it, then all sorts of crackpot stuff gets accepted.
Right.
On the other hand, and the argument is that if a new sort of standard or some new form of scholarship is really good, it'll keep knocking on the door and finally will get let in. So there's an argument for the conservatism.
Right.
But in the meantime, somebody says, I've got a new take, a new methodology or something, and I'm being denied tenure, I'm being denied a job, and this is an assault on not just my freedom, but on the academic values of the institution. So I find that that's a really difficult line to navigate, and I just wondered because a lot of the stuff I see being published in sort of fringe academic journals, I would say, that's not really the academy, and how did this person get hired in a respectable institution?
Sure.
But,
yeah, I think it's not an easy line to navigate, and I probably have some disagreements with Robert Post in thinking about, although I tend to share a lot of his basic argument on how to think about this, but I suspect there are going to be some cases where we wind up being on a different page about this. So Robert Post is a professor at Yale Law School, a prominent First Amendment scholar, among other things, but also has been very active with the AUP over time, has been a central figure in elaborating and implementing academic freedom on American universities over time. And he's particularly prominent in making this argument, which is a traditional AUP argument about how to think about academic freedom, that academic freedom is bounded by professional norms and expectations and disciplinary standards in various ways. And at one level, I think that, and so part of what I think I find very persuasive in his argument about that is we should think about this academic freedom context is very different from a free speech context, precisely because, in part, in a free speech context, we think every democratic citizen is equally entitled to their opinion, no matter how crackpot their opinion might be. That's a crucial principle of liberal democratic governance, that we accept that idea that everybody can pop off and say whatever they want, no matter how thinly grounded their opinions are on those kind of things. And that's crucial to how we ought to think about free speech doctrine, for example. And so, for example, the U.S. constitutional law and Supreme Court would say you can't have government officials making determinations about what counts as misinformation and bad political ideas and trying to suppress them. That's a very dangerous road to go down. We don't want government officials doing that. On the other hand, part of what we think is different about the scholarly world is you sort of do want your academic colleagues to say what counts as misinformation, and as a consequence say, you therefore don't pass your comp exams, and as a graduate student you can't have your dissertation defended with that crackpot theory. We're not going to hire you into a faculty position, we're not going to tenure you, we're not going to publish your article, et cetera. At some level, you can't have people saying, well, the university didn't tenure me because of my crackpot theories, but I have a free speech right to my crackpot theories. I think that is a problematic road to go down. On the other hand, I think this can be, especially in implementation, become very restrictive on individuals in ways that are quite problematic for how academia ought to operate. In its strong form, this kind of disciplinary standards perspective can become a tool of a real kind of majoritarian tyranny within disciplines where, well, look, me and a majority of the field think your theory is a crackpot, and we're going to suppress all of you outlying dissenters who disagree with us by labeling it as outside the mainstream of the discipline. And if you draw those boundaries too tightly, you can find yourself really shrinking what we ought to be doing, which is exploring new ideas, exposing ourselves to alternative arguments, et cetera. And so while it is true that I think in general it's a crackpot theory to say the earth is flat rather than round, for example, people who can actually marshal scientific arguments and say, no, wait, you're jumping too quickly to a conclusion that the earth is round. You ought to be open to having even very fundamental features of your disciplinary and heritage called into question and criticized if people are willing to apply serious academic tools to doing so. And I think academia can often be too quick to want to pull the rug out from that. And so there is a danger that is comparable to what we see in the free speech environment, that dissenters can be quashed under this kind of theory. But I think that's it sort of distinguishes between this sort of what are you legally entitled to and what ought you to be doing kind of thing, where partially we ought to be trying to encourage academics to be pretty open to allowing the dissenting perspectives on these things because it's better for the advancement of knowledge on the whole. Even if we also want to leave the door open for universities to be able to, for example, deny people tenure because they have a crackpot theory, or even sanction them and terminate them if they insist on teaching their crackpot theory as truth to their classes in their classroom, for example, despite the fact it's broadly rejected. So I think that as a consequence, there's going to be a lot of hard cases on that front, and I think some of those hard cases, Robert Post and I, for example, probably be on different sides of how to think about that. And I feel that probably a little more strongly than some might because of my own situation within academia in that regard, right? I mean, so when I started out in academia, I took academic freedom issues pretty much for granted. In part, I didn't think it was much of a worry from my perspective, and I was well situated in that regard. So I was lucky. Other people were not so lucky about being well situated in this regard. But I was not terribly worried that a university president was going to fire me because some donor was demanding it or something like that, right? And there were not a lot of instances of students demanding faculty be fired because they said something offensive in the classroom. And so that wasn't much on my mind that I worried about. On the other hand, my dissertation and initial work was partially on originalist theories of constitutional interpretation. Many scholarly colleagues working in the field of constitutional theory thought that's a crackpot theory and one should not be employed or tenured while pursuing that kind of scholarship, nor should it be published. And that was very much on my mind. About that was a far greater concern to me in trying to launch my career. And I don't think and I don't think academic freedom principles tell us much about protecting that. I think, but that is a question about how, as academic communities, we ought to govern ourselves and how open and tolerant we ought to be to people who disagree with us and are advancing dissenting views. And I think it's crucial for the academic enterprise that we be capable of actually tolerating some disagreement on these things and making space for dissenting perspectives, even though that's very hard to codify into formal rules in a lot of these circumstances.
One of the concepts that we haven't really talked about this afternoon that does come up in these conversations is the concept of intellectual diversity.
Yes.
Right. And this is something that Heterodox Academy, for
Yep.
instance, is sort of at the center of their mission. But it does seem not unrelated to these discussions about academic freedom, right? I mean, arguably, right, the value, whatever value
Right.
academic freedom serves, is only served to the extent that there's some sufficient level of intellectual diversity, right? I mean, if you
Right.
say to a group of faculty, you can all say whatever you want, but everybody thinks the same thing,
Right.
then you don't get that kind of million, right, marketplace of ideas emerging, right, where...
No, absolutely. Academic freedom is instrumentally useful to the extent it helps us with the advancement of truth, right? And it helps us to advance our understanding and be able to disseminate what we know to a set of people. And it's a very useful set of tools for helping us do that. But there are lots of other things that also get in the way of our being able to do that. And not having much intellectual diversity in academia is part of that. That if you're shutting the doors to people with different ideas, and you're doing it simply because they disagree with you, not because, for example, they are incapable of developing rational arguments or dealing with evidence or grappling with criticism, et cetera, then you are not serving the function of doing what it is universities ought to be doing. And quite rightly, you ought to be criticized for it and called on it. And unfortunately, I think universities do a lot of that. They often do, in fact, shut the door. Historically, they've often done that, right? And so partially people who often make this argument now, especially in the current context, that look, there are tensions between the desire for diversity and inclusion within academia and academic freedom concerns. And part of my concern is to say, look, universities were doing a bad job precisely to the extent that they were keeping people out of universities. The universities should have been opening their doors to a wide range of people who are willing to engage in the academic enterprise, but have a variety of perspectives and arguments and voices and ideas they want to bring to bear to that. And we are doing a much better job from that academic perspective if we are more successful in bringing people into the enterprise and engaging with them and listening to them as part of that process. But that's true on the intellectual diversity side as well. And on that front, we're not doing a very good job of even trying to be very diverse and inclusive from that perspective. And it goes directly to the core thing we're trying to do from an academic perspective, which is to seriously engage with ideas and engage with criticisms on it. And if we're going to take that commitment seriously, then we ought to be pretty concerned about academia that is not very politically and intellectually diverse. And unfortunately, that's a real problem, I think, in the way American higher education is currently structured.
I kept you around despite your flat earth interpretation of constitutional interpretation.
Yeah. So on the one hand, right. It feels like complaining from a position where I shouldn't be complaining about these things. But on the other hand, I got fortunate to work my way through this. I mean, that's I had lots of moments early in my career where it was not at all obvious I was going to maintain an academic career given these concerns. I certainly had encountered lots of people who were seemed to be very committed to not letting me continue in an academic career. But I was also extraordinarily fortunate in finding a whole set of people who were extraordinarily open. And it's precisely their model for how open they were, because most of those people disagreed with me deeply, but it's precisely how open they were that I take as a very model of what the best things in academia are. And part of the reason why I'm so excited about academia, why I wanted to make a space there, was precisely because of those kind of people. So my own dissertation advisor, Roger Smith, thought I was totally out to lunch with all my arguments. His scholarly work disagrees with all kinds of arguments I was making. But he also pressed me to make those arguments as well as I could and was very interested in saying, I want to see good versions of this argument. And so give me the best version of this argument that one can construct. And then we'll take it seriously and engage with it seriously. And he was willing to help move my dissertation through the process on that front. Some of the very earliest people I encountered as colleagues in academia early on were people like Mark Tushnet, who is a critical legal theorist that disagrees with originalism in deep ways, but was extraordinarily generous and hospitable with me in reaching out and being willing to comment on work and encouraging me at early stages in my career, precisely despite those disagreements. And those kinds of people who disagreed with me deeply, thought I was completely wrong-headed about all those issues, but nonetheless thought academia ought to be a place where we engage in those arguments and hear those arguments out, and we have that conversation and engage in those criticisms. And if you're willing to engage in that argument, let's have it. That's exactly what academia ought to be. And so those people, for me, represent sort of the highest ideals of what academia ought to be. And they are people I think about when I think about both not only my own personal success in actually navigating my way through an often hostile enterprise in higher education, but also they are exemplars of what I would hope at its best universities are. And people like that give me a lot of hope that the universities actually can be quite good on this front. Yeah.
Yeah, so here's a sort of meta question about openness to
Yeah.
different views. So as you know, because so suppose somebody says in an institution that's committed presumably to the version of the academy that you're espousing,
Right.
that what's with this rigor in intellectual debate? We've seen an example of this recently.
Right.
So this is a person who basically says, my perspective is to say to hell with your perspective generally, right?
Right.
So if you were administering, I mean,
Yeah.
so how open should you be to that view?
Yeah. So I think on the margins there's some challenges from that perspective. So as I said earlier, there are, I think, some key commitments we ought to be particularly focused on, even people who are questioning very fundamental things we think are true within our discipline, for example. So are they willing to marshal evidence? Are they willing to engage in analysis? Are they willing to hear criticism and respond to criticism such that they're willing to engage in the intellectual process that we expect within our particular discipline. Disciplines vary as to what that looks like, in order to try to push forward this theory that most people are not persuaded by within their particular set of claims, right? And so, and I think universities ought to be particularly open to that. The people who come to different conclusions, but they're willing to engage in the process, are people that universities in general ought to be open to letting in and welcoming. People who want to go even further than that, though, and question the process at some level, right, I think become much more challenging. There are smaller and bigger versions of that problem. So the smaller version is to say, the way our discipline is currently constructed is the wrong way of doing it. We ought to be doing it this different way. So to be parochial again, right? So there are debates within political science is a big, diverse discipline in lots of ways. I think much less diverse than when I first was attracted to going into it in terms of how it thinks about its subject matter and tries to proceed. There are certainly people in our discipline who think the people who do the kind of work I do aren't doing real political science, and really we shouldn't be making space for people like that in the discipline. So another set of conflicts I had as trying to start out is people who are doing the kind of theoretical and qualitative work I'm doing or don't belong in this science we're trying to do in political science. I think that's sort of a small difference in the sense of you can imagine saying, and so their view was sort of, well, that person belongs over in the law school or history department or something. It doesn't belong here in our little discipline of political science as we understand it. And I think universities ought to be relatively open to saying, okay, well, yeah, because disciplines have different ways of approaching things, they're a heterodox economist or whatever. They're engaged in something that we look at as a legitimate academic enterprise, but they don't really fit within the contours of how economics as a discipline is currently defined. There ought to be space within the university someplace else. And the interdisciplinary work partially has created spaces in universities to do that kind of thing. So I think that's a relatively small challenge. The deeper, harder challenge are the people who want to say, no, I reject anything that looks anything like what scholarly work looks like in a modern American university. I don't believe in reason. I don't believe in logic. I don't believe in facts. I don't believe in criticism and responding to criticism. I think it's hard to make space in universities for that. I mean, I do actually think that universities ought to understand themselves as being places where we're willing to engage in arguments, hear evidence, deal with facts, deal with logic. And if you're not willing to do those things, then universities are not the right place for you. And that does exclude some perspectives. But I think, and maybe there'd be openings to sort of challenge that too, right? I mean, I think you gotta always be open to hearing the claim about why they ought to have a space. But I'm pretty skeptical that there's actually space. So I do actually think some of those people probably who make those kind of radical challenges, maybe there's not good space for them.
Steve.
So just, following the media casually.
Yeah.
In the last 10 years, my sense is that this is becoming a more difficult problem on campuses. And the one narrative that I see regularly is that people to the far left that are kind of pushing a certain woke version of social justice are kind of against people who believe in traditional free speech. So I guess kind of like two questions, like, do you think that this is getting worse in the last 10 years? I think you probably do.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that? And then to what degree is this far left kind of social justice ideology, what percentage of that is the contribution to how things are getting worse? Is that the main problem or a major problem? That's the question.
I think things are getting worse. I think that's a major problem. It's not the only problem by a long shot. But I don't think it's a small problem either. And moreover, it depends a little bit on what you define as being the crucial elements, as you characterize as sort of these woke aspects of these disputes, as to just how confined the problem is. So for example, so I said earlier, for example, a lot of the free speech conflicts that occur on campus come from the left and often from this kind of perspective. But among the aspects of that is sort of leveraging these claims about safety and comfort and you're not making me feel safe on a campus, et cetera. That safetyism kind of rhetoric is increasingly not limited to the left. The students on the right have figured that out too, and they can also play that game. And so if that's the core component, then that's actually, I think, spreading ideologically and is used from a lot of different kinds of political perspectives to an increasing degree and is becoming more pervasive and troubling in that regard. There are other elements of sort of what we think of as being sort of the woke stuff that is more ideologically specific to the left and is likely to stay there and won't spread in quite the same way. But that element, that kind of argument, in all the arguments sort of surrounding hate speech, for example, all those arguments can be leveraged by the right just as easily as they can be leveraged by the left, and increasingly we're seeing people trying to do that. And so part of the challenge for people like me is how do you persuade people, look, we shouldn't be leveraging those arguments. Those are wrong arguments or bad arguments. You shouldn't try to leverage those arguments. We'll all be worse off if we leverage those arguments. But that's hard and challenging. One reason why so look, to some degree, as a teacher and as a writer, you have to be a little optimistic that ideas actually matter and you can actually persuade people to things. And so you sort of have to go into these kinds of debates optimistic that you can actually make a difference and can affect where things are. I also think that we are still at a point where a majority of the people on college campuses and more generally in society as a whole still accept these sort of traditional values and commitments relating to free speech and intellectual inquiry more broadly. I think the people who are pushing against that are still a distinct minority, although a very vocal and loud and influential minority. And so I think we're at a point where if you push back, there are people you can appeal to that can be persuaded that you're on the right side of this and you can still win these battles. Part of my concern is that may not be true 10 years from now. That if we continue to sit quietly, we continue to let these ideas spread, if we continue to let people not hear what the concerns are about these ideas, and so there's vast swaths of, I think, students, for example, that aren't really very invested in these things, but all they really hear is sort of one kind of perspective, and so they sort of take it for granted. Part of my goal in doing these things and speaking out about these things is to try to explain these concerns to those students, right? So the committed activists you're not going to persuade particularly, but there's a lot of students who haven't thought about it very deeply, have some built-in assumptions because of what they hear. They're persuadable, but they have to hear the arguments, and you have to make the case. And I worry that if we go a lot longer without actually making the arguments, making the case, we will increasingly lose generations on this front, and they will not understand these principles, won't value these principles, and ultimately the principles themselves will be sacrificed and abandoned. And I do think this is a generational shift in this regard, right? I mean, it is the younger side of the campus community that is where these kinds of restrictionist ideas have gotten the most traction. And it used to be, you sort of pointed to undergraduate students, but now it's increasingly grad students, postdocs, younger faculty, lots of other people on the campus as well. This has been going on for a while. You can see sort of the rising tide here, and if you don't start pushing against it, I think we're going to be in real trouble from this perspective. So I don't think the battle's lost yet, but I think if we don't get in there and fight it, universities are going to look pretty different 20, 30 years from now. And I think ultimately First Amendment doctrine is going to look pretty different 20, 30 years from now, because I tend to think that constitutional jurisprudence is sort of downstream from these kind of cultural and societal movements. And so I don't feel very comfortable that our First Amendment doctrine will be as robustly protective of free speech if we lose these sort of intellectual social battles over trying to explain to people why these actually matter and what the principles are and why they ought to care.
Helen?
One thing, there's just so many different questions that I could ask, but one thing that I'm thinking about is I teach social ethics, and something that I see students increasingly say is that they keep challenging the idea of rights.
Yeah.
I'm an 80s girl, so I'm like, okay, and not that I'm quite happy to talk about how they're grounded, but there aren't rights. So I'm just wondering about this idea of like free speech rights versus this idea of free speech as a practice.
Right.
Kind of the things that you were talking about. And again, when I went to college, I had my Marxist economics professor, and I had my Rawlsian political science professor, and I had my British atheist Thomas Natural Law. You could just go to whoever and have this variety of conversations, but it's a community.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's not, I don't see that. It's like we have to replicate it for the next generation, or else they're not going to know what that even is.
Right.
Right? So I just don't know if I just don't know how this free speech rights idea is going to play out, or if we should take a different approach.
Well,
I mean, I like rights, but if nobody else wants them, right?
So I guess I have two kinds of concerns here. So on the one hand, I do think this is part and parcel of fighting for the idea of rights. so from my perspective, it's actually important to preserve rights as well. And I see this as part of that larger battle for things I care about, at least. And so this is part of my angle into that, but I do sort of hope that there is a broader effect, that if you can sort of win this and perhaps persuade people, no, rights actually matter here, likewise it matters in some other contexts as well. So I do think it's a larger concern. I think there are deeper issues here, and I see that as this is part of that larger struggle over the future of how we think about these things. The other question, though, is I think more local and specific in some sense, and so I think there's not. So I think that you can only make so much progress by waving rights around as a way of talking about things, right? People don't find it very compelling if all you say to them is, I have a right to this, so screw you. And partially, I think the reaction of students these days in particular is in the specific context of free speech, that part of their experience of people who talk about free speech is they're harassed by people online, and when somebody pushes back, they say, it's my free speech. And then they're like, well, that's what free speech is, then who needs it, right? And so part of what needs to be done then is explain, well, look, you actually do need it, and here's why. But you can't do it just by screaming, I got rights to free speech. You have to actually walk it through and explain, okay, how is this related to things we care about? What are the problems of throwing this overboard? What's the downsides here if we abandon this kind of framework for thinking about these issues? What are we going to sacrifice if we aren't careful? I think those arguments are good ones. I think there's a case to be made on that front, that if we sacrifice these protections, there are real costs to that, and there are lots of people, I think, who are persuadable to that point, but you have to explain it as to how these things are connected. And so when I think about academic freedom, part of how I've tried to frame it generally is to try to think about that, and free speech more broadly on university campuses, is these are tied to a certain vision of what universities do, and they are instrumentally and procedurally useful for advancing that vision. So one kind of concern you have to be able to walk through then is, are they actually tied to that vision, and can you sacrifice them or modify them in various ways and still accomplish the thing that you're trying to accomplish? And so one part of the argument has to be concerned with that. But the other kind of argument is that actually the vision that people want, right? Is that the kind of institution you want? Is that the kind of university you want? Is that the kind of society you want, if we're talking about democratic free speech rights more generally, for example? And that too has to be defended and explained, right? That this is a useful thing for universities to be doing. This is actually not something we want to throw overboard. Here's why it's actually useful. And so this is something we ought to commit to. And once we commit to it, then these other things ought to follow from it. And here's why. And I do think that's an argument that has to be made to both the political right and the political left, right? And so so on the right, you do have a lot of people who are sort of caught up in the idea that they think free speech rights are important on campus in various ways, and so they're concerned about these campus free speech controversies. And part of what I've been concerned with is trying to leverage that to say, okay, but why should you be concerned about this, and why do you think that's true? And the implications are because there's a certain vision of a university that you ought to care about, and if that's true, and I can get you from your concern about what bothers you about this free speech controversy to embracing this larger vision of the university, then maybe it'll help persuade you that the anti-critical race theory legislation is not such a great idea, right? and why you should not run to the ramparts to try to get some professor fired when some professor says something you don't like in that specific context. And likewise, the same arguments on the left, right? And so you got to meet people where they are and where their own concerns are, and then try to work them through the parts. But there's a lot of parts there, and it's you can see people getting off the bus at various points in that process. And so, and like everything else, right, I have to be committed to the idea that I could be wrong about some of this stuff, right? And so and we try to engage in the arguments, hear what the concerns are, and then try best you can to work it through.
I think we have time for maybe one more. Mario?
I mean, this is just a thought-formulated thought, because I have thought a lot of things now that you were talking, Kid. And I was just wondering if this is a problem of, maybe building on Steve's question, if this is a problem of some sort of social norms and some sort of like people asking for things and people that are noisy asking for things, then it seems that the problem, or that the solution, or that at least a moment of the solution lies in the actions of the administrators. Right, and you started saying that, and I didn't understand why that was important, but now I understand it. And I guess my question is, it seems that the administrators have an incentive to be sensitive to these vocal people, because the students are their clients in a way. Right. So they just don't want to deal with people closing classrooms and making noise in their own. So what would be the incentive for them to be committed to this sort of freedom of speech, of diversity, of equality? If you have an idea on that,
So I think it's hard. I think it's probably multifaceted. So it depends some on which administrators we're talking about, and because I think the challenges are different. And so, um, so at one level, you get a set of administrators. They're sort of mid-level bureaucracy in universities. They're on sort of the front lines dealing with a lot of these student life issues and other kinds of disciplinary issues, who come completely outside of academia, right? They're professionalized and socialized in a completely different set of considerations and concerns. They have no experience in the academic side of the university more generally. Their own institutional mission within the university is very different. They're trying to accomplish different objectives and concerns than the faculty are. And so we have found ourselves over time bringing in a huge body of people, and it's not only those people, but there's other components of universities too. You'd say similar things about the development office in universities, for example. They got their own incentives, their own professionalization, et cetera. They don't understand the academic side of the university. It's a completely different world to them. And they're responding to their own localized institutional incentives. And so we've created universities with big swaths of them composed of these kind of administrators who know nothing about and care nothing about the academic side of the university. They've got a different mission that they're trying to advance. So partially, I think it's critical that university leaders just set the right example all the way from the top down, and it's crucial that then it be scholars who are leading universities and can commit universities to saying, look, the scholarly mission is the centerpiece, and everything else has to be adjusted to that in order to fit within that framework, and make sure they get that message from the top down. And it's hard to do. It requires consistent effort, and I think a lot of universities are not very good at doing it. But I do think the institutional drives are always going to be there on the other side of things. I think we ought to be doing a better job of professionalizing and socializing those people. Recognize that they're going to be persistent features of universities, and trying to do a better job of early in their process trying to communicate that these are academic values, are part of what we do here, and need to be protected, and let me explain what they are to you. So they will be worked into their professionalism and their cycle of how they operate as professionals, but we don't do a very good job of that right now either, I think particularly. I also think from a university leadership perspective, sort of we're not talking so much about these sort of mid-level bureaucrats, but thinking more about sort of university presidents and senior leadership of universities. There's also an interesting question about what their incentives are and what they respond to, right? So a lot of them are former scholars. They come from the academic side. They presumably should understand some of these things. They don't always, in part because we don't do a very good job of socializing faculty into these things, and mass faculty don't understand academic freedom either. And so lo and behold, then some of them become presidents and they don't understand academic freedom particularly. But it's also a question of what their incentives are to care, right? And so when a particular controversy arises, or a donor comes and says, I don't like this person who's causing problems for my business interests, for example, there's a lot of incentives on the part, our bunch of students are protesting outside the office of the president or whatever. There's a lot of incentives on the part of university presidents to cave into those pressures. I do think a lot of university presidents, for example, imagine that their jobs are at stake when when students are protesting outside their office. They actually do think that they will lose their job if they can't do that, or they do think their university revenues are going to go down, students are not going to enroll, and all kinds of other things, right? Partially, I think then that one reason to have an organization like the Academic Freedom Alliance is to put pressure on the other side of that equation. To try to incentivize them to say, no, there are people pushing from the other side. It's not costless to sacrifice these values. It's not all upside if you go the other direction on this. And at the very least, we should make it costly to you by not only costly in terms of publicity, but also costly to you and potentially in terms of legal settlements. This should be priced into your behavior, and hopefully that can incentivize it. That will not always be a winning calculation, right? I mean, it's sometimes the case that university presidents might decide it will be better to pay this person to go away than the cost it's going to do us on the other side of the institution from lost donations and whatever else. So we should recognize that all you can do is balance the equation, right? But I think we need to be trying to balance that equation to some degree. So to take an example that we're involved with now, for example, is MIT disinvited Dorian Abbott, who's a professor at University of Chicago, from giving an honorary lecture about his subject matter expertise, which is climate science and effects on planets. And they disinvited him precisely because a lot of campus activists in this case, but not just sort of undergrad students, but postdocs and faculty and the like, wanted to disinvite him because he had published unpopular things about affirmative action in universities. He's a critic of affirmative action, and a lot of people take the view that critics of affirmative action should not have a place at a university. They ought to be banned from university life in general, and specifically banned from this. MIT caved into this, the specific department caved into this, and disinvited him from giving this scientific lecture. I think this is a horrible example to set for how universities ought to operate. It's terrible for the intellectual project of what universities ought to be doing in general. But this was also an example where they were hearing a lot of pressure from one side of the equation when they were making that decision, didn't hear much from the other side. One thing they are now hearing is a lot of objection to the other side. So the Academic Freedom Alliance is very public about this. We helped, we're not the only ones, but we've helped lead the charge on trying to call public attention to this. This is one space where I think public attention worked in our favor because a lot of MIT alums think it's pretty ridiculous for MIT to not be willing to hear scientific lectures because people have political disagreements with the scholar involved, right? That's not consistent with the culture of what a lot of MIT alums thought their institution was committed to. So their university presidents, their university leadership is hearing from the other side on this. We have raised the cost on that person from having made that decision, and the hope is the other university presidents will take notice of that and realize if I do the same thing, there may be cost to me in similar ways. This will be a black eye on my university. If I disinvite somebody, as opposed to thinking, which a lot of them do, it might be a black eye on my university if I allow this talk to go forward. You're not always going to win those things, but you got to be in the fight, I think, in order to help balance out the other side on this stuff. And so I think trying to affect those incentives and that administrators are listening to is part of that process of how you sustain these things. I mean, at one basic level, right, I'm a realist about these things. Incentives are crucial to the whole thing, right? So universities adopted a tenure system in the early 20th century, in part because the AAUP was lobbying for it and explaining why this is really valuable for academic freedom. You got to have tenure to help sustain it, et cetera. But also because it was a tight labor market, and the universities, in order to actually persuade people to come work for the universities, had to offer them a better package in order to get them to do it, and tenure was part of that, right? And so when you had a tight labor market, universities thought it was in their interest in trying to attract faculty to offer academic freedom protections and protections for tenure. But a tight labor market was an essential part of that calculation in order to affect the incentives that universities face. And so I just don't think we can be naive or blind to those kinds of underlying realistic calculations that universities are making that have consequences for academic freedom. At one level, we got to make the argument about the ideas and why this is actually a good thing to be doing. But in part, you also got to think about what incentives are people confronting and how do you affect that calculation.
Yep. Please join me in thanking Keith Whittington.
Thank you.